have our panel on international trade, and we have three distinguished guests, and we'll try to keep this fairly informal, so no worries about being too formal, because we're keeping it informal. That said, we're going to be talking about international trade. We have some specific questions. We may have to cut the questions early if we're running out of time, because I want to open it up to the audience and to all of you guys, so you can ask any questions you like. And otherwise, you've all submitted these questions, and we have some winning questions that we'll cover. That said, the way the panel will be set up is we'll start off by having each panelist introduce themselves, take about 5 minutes to talk about your background, what you've done, what you're currently doing, and maybe some insight about why international business is important and why international trade is important to understand, even if you may never plan to live abroad or work abroad, why you still need to understand these things and how they affect us and how they might affect you. That said, once we're done with the introductions, we'll go through the questions and then we'll open it up for audience participation. So we'll begin with, at the far end, Derek Miller, and I'll let him introduce himself, tell you a little bit about his history. They've all seen your bios, so, but please tell us again a little bit about.
Well, and if you have the bio in front of you, you can track it and see if I actually
hit everything.
First of all, I'm glad to be with each of you today. I'm a 3-time BYU graduate. Good to be back in my old stomping grounds. I grew up in Orem, Provo, and both my parents teach here at Brigham Young University. Grew up watching Gifford Nielsen play football. Does anyone remember who that is?
I didn't know.
Did you guys notice that? When he referenced Gifford Nielsen, he put the glasses on,
yeah.
So he looked more mature.
Yeah. They were meant to make me look younger.
Sorry.
I'm the president and the CEO of the World Trade Center Utah, and we're a nonprofit organization that has been identified and designated by the state of Utah as the entity responsible for export promotion. And our mission statement our formal mission statement is to help Utah companies think, act, and succeed globally. We do that in 3 primary ways. The first thing that we do is we hold seminars and international business forums that are designed to educate and motivate Utah companies to expand into overseas markets. Our seminars are not meant to be a business course where we're teaching you everything that you need to know, but it's rather to motivate and to really demystify the process of taking your business into overseas markets. The second thing that we do is a little bit more advanced. Once you get through that Exporting 101, we'll do business-to-business consultations with companies, and those consultations are designed to build capacity within Utah companies for international trade and international business. The third thing that we do, this is kind of a fun and interesting thing, is we host diplomatic visitors to the state of Utah and help them connect to the Utah business community. You may or may not be aware that Utah receives really an inordinate amount of diplomatic visitors. The primary reason for that is that Utah is the headquarters of an international church. And if you're wondering what church that is, just think of what university you're part of. And a lot of visitors, ambassadors, consuls general, ambassadors to the UN, come through to our state, and as part of their visit, they have an interest in connecting to the business community. And so we will host luncheons and other networking events where they can do just that. And I think I've got maybe 1 minute left. By way of my background, I just joined the World Trade Center Utah about 6 months ago. Prior to that, I served as the Chief of Staff to Governor Herbert. I did that for about 4 years. Prior to that, I worked at the Governor's Office of Economic Development as the Managing Director and as the Deputy Director. And prior to that, I worked and lived in Washington, D.C., where I spent some of my time in private practice and some of the time working on Capitol Hill as an attorney for one of the congressional committees. Did I cover the waterfront? Yeah, pretty good.
So my name is Harvey Scott. I'm actually really happy to be here. Shad and I go way back, so this is a favor to Shad. He now owes me 3 lunches. So this is a good thing. And I told him it was restricted last time. He took me to someplace here on campus, and I said, "You got to take me someplace off campus where there's really good food." And he said, "Oh, trust me, you'll be impressed." So he took me. Where'd you take me to?
Cannon Center?
The Cannon Center.
I just took Jennifer to the Cannon Center as well.
I'll tell you what, you guys want to go for a good lunch? That's not the guy.
Now he owes you 4 lunches.
I'm actually really grateful to be here. Actually, Derek and I, we have a past together, as do Jennifer and I. Before joining Blendtech, where I'm at now, I worked for the Governor's Office of Economic Development, and I ran international trade and diplomacy for the state. It was a fantastic gig. Before that, I was in that role for 2 years. Before that, I was in venture capital. We started and managed a fund out of Mexico called Alta Ventures. You guys might be familiar with that. Previous to that, I worked for a company called Rolls-Royce. And I was at Rolls-Royce in Japan, in the UK, and in the US. I've lived in 8 countries in total, including the US. I speak a little Chinese, a little Spanish, a little bit of Portuguese, some Japanese, and I do international business for a career. This is what I've done my whole life, my whole career. So with Blendtech, I'm really tasked at going global again. So they tried to go global initially, and it was a great attempt, but we're restructuring and re-strategizing. So I'm grateful to be here. If I can help in any way, I'm happy to do that.
Okay, I'm Jennifer Andelin, and I just appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's been quite a few years since I've been back to BYU, and I think I'm on the panel for diversity. Because for those of you who are focused on international and business, these are your guys that can have all your answers. My path has been very different. I graduated in Latin American Studies. And people are thinking, what on earth are you going to do with that? Well, I stayed home and I raised 5 kids. But during that time, I got very active in the community. And I sat on the planning commission, I chaired the planning commission, I had battles with the mayor and learned that my voice mattered. I got involved in sister city work, and I've been to Russia 10 times, worked on one of the projects we worked with other cities. It was a $5 million project. We did healthcare, women's health and emergency medicine. I've traveled with our police and fire departments. I'll never forget, I'm sitting in the Ministry of Defense in Moscow, and I'm the volunteer, and I've got the police chief here, and I tell him to sit there, and the Russians came over and said, "No, this is your seat. You are in charge." And I tell you, it makes you realize that you can go places that maybe you never thought you would go. Because I was involved in politics, I was always looking for better people to run for city council or mayor, and I asked, well, a friend of mine, who's going to be running at the federal level? I'd like to get to know a candidate before they become popular, and everybody's talking about them. And she said, well, actually, I met with this guy named Jason Chaffetz, and he's considering running. And so I had the first cottage meeting that Jason ever held in my home with about 10 of my neighbors. And so I got involved in the campaign in a small way, but then when he won, I put in a resume with about 500 other people that applied, and my background in Latin American studies was enough to get me a job doing the immigration work for the office. Now, I'm not an attorney. I didn't know immigration before, but I tell you, I have learned, and it is a mess. The laws regarding immigration are really convoluted, and I was hoping I would see a little more diversity. Is anybody here on a student visa? Yay! You guys have got to get more diversity in here. It's extremely hard to get a student visa. So I do the immigration work, I do community outreach, international, that's how I met Harvey. I even started my own business that was hosting international visitors. So for about 10 years, I hosted delegations that came through the state. So very different from theirs, but glad to be here.
Thanks, Jennifer. Well, that said, let's open it up. We have some good questions. We're going to start off with, I think this is a fun question to start off with. As an entrepreneur, we have some entrepreneurship students and students who are interested in starting up a business, trying to do business here in the U.S. Why do I even need to care and worry about international trade and what's going on outside of the U.S. market? How does that affect me if I just want to start a small company here in Utah or back in my home state, wherever I'm going? So that's sort of the first question that we want to throw out. I mean, why take an international business class? How does that affect me?
Well, they're going to be competing, aren't they, whether they know it or not?
They are. And I don't think you have to think global, right? It's only 93% of the world's purchasing power happens outside of the U.S., right? Focus on the seven. You can take that perspective, and there are a lot of companies who do, but you're missing out on huge opportunities. And not only are you missing out on those opportunities, I think you're allowing, as Jennifer said, other markets to compete in a way that they might not necessarily have the opportunity to as you thought globally.
One of the things that we just began doing at the World Trade Center Utah was a rural outreach effort. We have in Utah about 5% of our companies that could be exporting are exporting. And I remember the first time I heard that number, I thought, boy, gosh, it's only 5%. And then I heard the national number, which is 1%. So we're 5 times the national average, but we're still really low when it comes to the number of companies that could be involved in exporting. And so we've begun an effort to reach out beyond the Wasatch Front and to start to talk to these companies that are in rural Utah about how they could get involved in exporting. And specifically, Shad, to your question, one of the things that I always talk to companies about is whether you think you are going to do international business or not, the fact is that you are going to be impacted by what's happening internationally. And I'll share with you just very briefly the story that I share with companies, and that is the story of our family farm, which is on the Idaho-Montana border along the beautiful Centennial Mountain Range. This is my grandpa's farm. It's an alfalfa farm, and part of it's irrigated and part of it's a dry farm. When I grew up visiting this farm, if any of you grew up on a farm, or if you're like me, one generation removed from growing up on a farm, there's only one thing that farmers talk about. That's the farm. I mean, if you're a farmer, all you talk about is the farm. And when they would talk about the farm, when I was growing up in the 70s, they would and 80s, they would talk about, you know, what's the weather like, what neighbor is stealing water, and you know, whether they were going to get 2 cuts of hay. Today, when you talk about that farm, this tiny little farm on the Idaho-Montana border, you talk about what's happening in Russia, what's happening in China. I mean, this farm, if this farm is impacted by what's happening in the world, every business is being impacted by what's happening in the world.
So we're going to go to the next question. How was your company? So specifically to, I guess, Harvey would be your company, but also could apply to companies here in Utah. How have they been affected? How were they affected by the 2008 financial crisis? And what did they do to
How much time do you have?
weather that storm?
I mean, the 2008 financial crisis was, that's a really, really broad question, Sean. So I don't know exactly who asked that question and what you were trying to sort of get answered in that. Is there anybody in here that asked that question? Tell me what exactly you're looking for.
Kind of like, what was the international response? Because I know that like stocks flown in the United States, and then that did affect it internationally. But there's also a lot of people that actually utilize their international branches to maintain their wealth income. And so like I was just wondering kind of, especially the financial side and the international side, how that transition happened, what was discussed, kind of thing.
I'm trying to remember where I was in 2008. I was in Rolls Royce. I was living in the UK. And we were just planning to make a move back to the US. And I do remember, so if you're talking specifically about finance, in fact in Blendtec we're going through this right now. What's happening to the US dollar right now today? It's appreciating, it's all other currencies, right? And so what happens to our product internationally? It gets more expensive, right? Because they're having to buy. They're buying in US dollars, right? And so our $400 blender now becomes a $450 or a $500 blender, right? And so our ability to sell, their purchasing power has decreased. And so what we're trying to do now, and this is, I called this 8 months ago when I first joined Blendtec, they have no hedging policy, right? And so because everybody's buying, everyone know what a hedge is, right? So everybody's buying US dollars, so we needed to figure out a way to make a transition away from the US dollar, allow them to buy in native currency, and we take the risk on the hedge. So we can spot buy a currency in dollars to cover our risk or our exposure when we're selling in a currency. So the very same thing happened in 2008. And I can't speak to the specifics about Blendtec, but for Rolls Royce, at the time we had a 50 billion pound order book. Right? If anybody knows what Rolls Royce does, we're an aerospace manufacturing company, and we build these very large jet gas turbines that sit on the side of your airplane and push you along the air. Right? These things create 80,000 pounds of thrust. They're huge. You can stand inside the diameter of the housing. They're amazing. And so by the time we were done with all the devaluation, all the problems in the market, we had about a 30 billion pound order book. So we took a 20 billion pound hit in a matter of about 9 months. Now it's a 90 billion pound order book, and things are looking much better for them. But the 2008 financial crisis didn't just affect small businesses, it affected large businesses, it affected housing prices, it affected everything. So it's a really broad question, kind of hard to answer, and I hope that helps a little bit.
I'd love to answer this question. We got these questions in advance, which was helpful, and I want to take a different tack on answering the question, one that you may not have been thinking about when you asked it. In 2008, I was working with the Governor's Office of Economic Development. And I want to tell you this story because I think it may be of interest to you of how the state responded. And there's an international component to this, so bear with me when we get to the end of this story. We could see the financial crisis coming because Utah is typically lagging in its economic trends. Doesn't mean that we're less than other states. In fact, most of the time we're more, but we're usually about 6 months to a year behind where we see the rest of the country in economic trends. So in this case, it was really an interesting position because we could see that economic tsunami headed our way. I mean, we saw it on the horizon. We saw what was happening in other states. And sure enough, true to form, it hit us. We went as a state from 1 year, one fiscal year to the next, the first year having the greatest surplus of tax revenue, meaning our economy was awesome. We actually had, in 2006, the best performing economy in the country. It was the fastest growing economy of all 50 states. To the very next fiscal year to having the greatest deficit in tax revenue in our state's history. So in 1 year, we saw that wave hit us. And the story is this, we could see it coming, and the governor convened a meeting, of his economic development team, as well as a lot of great business leaders, and asked this very simple question: what can we do? Given what we see headed our way, what are we going to be able to do about it? And I remember in that meeting, I don't remember who, but I remember someone, had a very simple but very sage comment, and that was, and it's a business principle, and the business principle was, if you want to grow in a contracting market, what do? There's only one thing you can do. That's grow your market share. If you're an expanding market, you can maintain market share and grow. But if you're in a contracting market and you want to grow, you have to grow market share. And so how did that business principle translate for Utah? It meant we had to put an increased effort on attracting and recruiting new businesses to our state. And so that's exactly what we did. We put a full court press, and very shortly I'll just tell you, Utah was actually a beneficiary of the recession, because you had companies doing things that they had never considered doing before because they were focused on the bottom line like they never had been focused before. And so suddenly going to Silicon Valley and trying to convince companies that saving $100 million off the bottom line, in 2006 they couldn't have cared less. In 2008, those same companies would have done anything to save $100 million off the bottom line. And that's the time that you saw Procter & Gamble, eBay, Adobe, Hershey, Disney, Goldman Sachs, all of these multinational companies, and this is the international part of it, all of these multinational companies started looking at Utah as the place where they needed to do their business expansion. So Utah made a great name for itself during the recession as an economic safe haven. And now it's time to do the same thing on a global scale.
Okay. Is there ever a time when free trade is not a good thing?
It's a trick question.
Is there ever a time when free trade is not a good thing? I mean, Derek, World Trade Center here, you guys are pushing free trade, aren't you?
So our mission is to promote prosperity through trade. So, we're as free trade as it gets. Nevertheless, I want to answer the question honestly, and that is there probably are times when free trade doesn't make sense, and because there's an exception to every rule, right? For example, the reason why free trade, in my opinion, works so well is because it allows companies a level playing field to maximize their competitive advantage. In a nutshell, in my opinion, that's the value of free trade. We have the TPP that we're working on as a nation right now, which will create level playing fields with Pacific Asia countries. We have the TTIP, which will continue to level playing fields with countries in the European Union.
We haven't talked about these trade agreements yet in class.
So those are, now you don't have to come to class next time. You just But that's to create level playing fields so that companies can maximize their competitive advantage. But the truth is, there are some countries and there are some companies within those countries where they're not evolved enough yet that they have a competitive advantage. They're sort of still in that incubator phase. And so I guess I would make the argument that there are probably countries where it makes sense for them to provide some protection to their industries until they mature enough that they actually can develop their competitive advantage.
If I can, I'd add something too. And I think a lot of us have wondered for so long why trade with Cuba, right? Why do we have a trade policy or a trade embargo with Cuba? Why don't we do trade with? Anybody heard of ITAR? That's another trade restriction, right? Basically, what it says is that there are certain countries in this world that we do not trade specific products with. Most of them have to do with military equipment, right? And so Cuba was aligned with whom? With Russia, right? And so our fear, and I don't necessarily agree with the policy on Cuba, but for years we've been afraid to trade with Cuba because many times we're not sure what they're giving to the Russians. Just like you see some of what we do with China ends up in North Korea, right? So there are certain reasons, yes, certainly because of burgeoning industries, and some countries will want to protect that. I think from my perspective, from the U.S. perspective, there are also countries that I wouldn't want to trade with because they're not our friends. We don't know what's going to come back to us.
Jennifer can clarify this. I think I heard Congressman Chafin say, not that he applauded the effort of the White House and the administration, but I don't believe he was very critical of what is being done with Cuba now. Am I
Right, right, yeah. He sees it as a positive move. You've got to be very careful. I thought it was interesting when I listened to the news and they're saying, okay, the U.S. diplomats are coming down, and they're going to be discussing this, and what shows up right outside the, at the port? The Russian spy ship. I mean, there's a lot more to trade than just who's going to get the right price for what item. But, I know that the congressman, he supports moving towards normalized relationships. Let's see how it goes.
When we recently did a trade mission to Israel that Harvey helped to plan and prepare for, and we had a meeting with the then president of Israel, Shimon Peres. If you're not familiar with the man, Shimon Peres, I'd encourage you to learn a little bit about him. As we were walking into the meeting, the Israeli consul general, who had shepherded us through our trade mission, he kind of tugged on my sleeve as we were walking in, and he leaned over to me and he whispered in my ear, he said, "Derek, this would be like if you were meeting with George Washington." And it was such such a strong statement. It really caught me by surprise. And I think you could see on my face that I was surprised by that remark. This would be like if you're meeting with George Washington. And so he went on to explain, he said, Shimon Peres, he fought in our War of Independence. This man was 90 years old at the time. This was a year and a half ago that we were there. He fought in our War of Independence. He's served in every ministerial cabinet position there is, including prime minister twice. And now he's the president of our country. I mean, he is their founding father. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is because of what you said, Jennifer, that one of the things that Shimon Peres said to us was, and think of this comment in context of what is happening in that part of the world. He said, the key to lasting peace is economic prosperity. The key to lasting peace is economic prosperity. Why? Because through trade relations and developing business relations, you typically don't go to war with your friends. And you don't go to war with people that you do business with. You just typically don't do that. And so Shimon Peres saw that, the way that you grow out of conflict is by mutually beneficial economic relations.
I think of another, sorry, I just have to say one thing. These guys are already tired of hearing from me. But I tell them I'm a fairly radical free trader, but I also see times when sanctions are, I typically don't like sanctions. I think, especially with Cuba, I think it's an outdated policy. But there are times when sanctions are needed, especially right now with Russia and what Russia's doing in Ukraine. And that's sort of one of the only ways you can get their attention, get them to move. So, anyway.
Have any of you been following that, the whole Russian ordeal? It's amazing to me, right? So there's a lot of debate, and Derek would be the guy that could debate this about Obama's policies, right? And it's very interesting to me to watch what's happened with Crimea and Ukraine, and now Russia's crumbling economy. They've set it out very distinctly that they want to have a more aggressive military policy. And just today it was announced that Putin has to reduce his budget by some, 30% or something, because there's just
the greatest reduction in their history.
Right? So it's very interesting how trade can impact politics and policy, and vice versa. There's a wonderful relationship there. So sometimes not so wonderful.
And I've kind of followed that more closely than some other people because, like I say, we have a sister city in Russia. I've done a lot of work with Russia. And most of the recent delegations I've hosted have been judges from Ukraine. So I have really close ties to Ukrainians and close ties to Russians. And they are hesitant, the population themselves are hesitant to say very much over the internet, not knowing who will get what information and what might be done with that. But it's a very serious condition, and the Russians felt it. The Russians in their stores felt it very quickly, that the products they were used to buying were not there, and it's just been getting worse and worse. So.
Well, Harvey, you made a comment at the beginning of this session about the challenges with the appreciation of the value of the dollar. So, take that trend and now apply the specific Russian situation to it, where their currency, the ruble, is devaluing, dramatically. So some of you may have heard recently, as I did, that Apple, as an example, has had to cease, temporarily put a hold on selling any of their products in Russia, because you had the appreciating dollar and the depreciating ruble, and they were just, the typical iPhone, for $400 or $500, they were just, they were losing money on every single sale. So they had to just say, stop until we can get this situation figured.
The interdependency to me is amazing. So Russia's largest export is what? Natural gas and oil, right? And so, and oil is, the denomination that oil sells and buys in is dollar, right? So it is very, very interesting, these intricate relationships. And if you look at any economy in the world today who doesn't diversify away from oil, look what's happening to them just in the last 8 weeks, right? And look what's happened to our dollar. It's very interesting. And it's hugely impactful. Not just to us because we watch it on TV, but because I go to the gas station now and I fill up, right? And it's 20 extra bucks in my pocket every time I fill up.
It goes back to the farm, right?
It does.
Because I'm the same way. This last week I drove down to St. George and I'm cheering the whole way because I'm filling up, with, even at the expensive places right off the freeway, it's still $2 a gallon. And I'm telling my kids, we can eat this weekend. We can eat. And yet, at the same time, think of that same gas station and that has the convenience store in the Uinta Basin, just an hour and a half drive from where we sit today, that's now going out of business because the oil and gas exploration is slowing down in the Uinta Basin. So, you push one side of the balloon and the other side pops out, and it's hard.
Yeah, and think about North Dakota, right?
Right.
And their whole economy this last 5 years has been based on oil and oil exports. And of course now with oil where it's at, their entire economy has crumbled. And people who moved to North Dakota to have those jobs no longer exist.
Real people with real families.
So they come back home and they try to find jobs in economies like Utah, where we are blessed enough to have a very, very diverse economy.
And that's such a key, is the diversity of our economy. So, when you were talking about the companies going out of business, I don't know if a lot of the people realize that when gas goes low, we lose those companies, and they don't just turn off a switch and then go back 2 or 3 years later and turn the switch back on. They may have totally gone out of business. Somebody else has to pick it up. So for us to get back up to the level of production that we were, striving for is going to be more difficult in the future. It just take more time, more effort.
I was still cheering.
Yeah, but at the pump I cheer too.
All right, so next question. What are your opinions on the U.S. trade deficit, and what should be done?
One thing we're really, I'll start out with one thing, and you guys can go on. We encourage exporting oil, feeling like if we export it, the demand will be here. We'll have more demand for our own production. That's one thing we're supporting.
And Utah is a net exporter of energy. The U.S., of course, is not, but Utah is.
The trade deficit, Is this a politics class?
We get into political issues.
No, it does. It definitely.
That's why Jennifer's
affects-
here.
That's right. So maybe you should answer this. No, I don't have a really strong opinion about the deficit. I know it continues to grow, and I probably should have a vested interest in understanding it more fully. I think what it does, if there is a time in our history, right, you can look back in the 80s when the dollar was cheap, and then it grew and strengthened against all of the currencies in the 90s, and then now today is a great time to pay off any debt that we have. Our dollar is so strong. And so if they're holding US dollar debt, that doesn't help us much, right? In fact, that just enriches them more as they make the conversion. But it puts our economy in a very difficult position, especially as we ebb and flow. And if, for instance, we are not raising enough money to pay the burden of that debt, we go on default, right? And that's obviously not what we want to do. So I think we need a more prudent approach to trade. I think we need to be more responsible in the way that we trade and when we trade. I think we need to continue to grow our manufacturing base in the U.S. and continue to push exports. That is one way that we, of course, will balance the deficit. I also think that there needs to be a renewed focus on innovation. The only way that the U.S. economy stays strong is if we continue innovating. If we stop innovating, we're in trouble. Because every other country in the world can manufacture as well as we can. We don't retain any of that anymore. There are printed circuit boards, in fact. We don't do the base PCB anymore. All those boards are all done overseas. They're done in Vietnam or China. Right? There are certain industries that are not cost effective to bring back to the U.S. So the only way that we continue to grow is we continue to innovate. And that's why students like yourself, entrepreneurs like yourself, are so very, very critical, especially the sciences. Because as you continue to innovate and you manufacture, that creates more jobs here, we can retain our livelihoods. That's my point.
You know, I'm really a schizophrenic on this issue. Because I actually have two really strong opinions, and they're kind of diametrically opposed. Yet I feel strongly about both of them, and I'll explain why. On its face, I don't have a problem with the trade deficit, because I'm a free trade guy, and I'm a free market guy, and I'm a capitalist. So I figure, you know, if certain companies have a competitive advantage, it's not going to matter to me if that company is in country A or country B. And the U.S., of course, is a consumer-driven country. I don't say that in a negative way. In fact, if anything, it's positive because it drives our economy. So that's the one side of my schizophrenic personality. The other side is to understand that you have to get sort of beyond the trade deficit where it just says, you know, we're importing more than we're exporting. And let me explain why. When you get beyond just that, you know, think of the logic for a second. If we're buying more as a country than we're taking in, how do you balance that? I mean, there's a missing component, right? There's a missing component that you usually don't hear about when you talk about trade deficit. And that missing component is borrowing. That's the problem. That's the part of the equation I have the problem with. Because where are you making up the difference in the money? You're borrowing the money. And who are you borrowing it from? You're borrowing it from foreign countries. That's why 40 cents of every dollar that the U.S. spends, we borrow. And that's the part of the equation that troubles me. That difference between the imports and the exports is borrowing, and it's bad for our economy that we're borrowing that much money. The second part of it, of course, is that I want to see the exports go up. I want to see that balance. So again, while I don't have a fundamental problem with the fact that we may be buying more things overseas, because I say if they can build it better, then I want to buy the better, cheaper product. But I want to see us building the better, cheaper product. I want to see the U.S., I want to see Utah companies, like a great company like Blendtec, being the company that has the competitive advantage. So I don't want to do anything to manipulate it externally, I want us as a state and as a country to be more successful and to eliminate the trade deficit that way.
And politically, we look at it as how much deficit is there and who owns the debt? Is it, the biggest country that owns the biggest portion of the debt is China. Politically, is that a good position to be in with the amount of debt that they, that we owe to them?
With one upside, they don't want the dollar to fail. Because they own our debt.
Related to that question, something we do in class is we ask Siri where she was made. And I don't know if you've ever done that, but she tells you she was designed in California. And then we kind of press her, and she won't tell you where she was made. She just says it was designed in California. But we know she was made in China. So based on that, someone asked in the class asked, how do other countries view U.S. products coming into their markets? Do they see them sort of resentfully, or do they like U.S. products? And do they see many U.S. products? And if so, what are those products?
I think by and large, countries around the world love to buy these products. They are the best made, the best branded. They carry a lot of sort of notoriety that comes with buying a U.S. product. Blendtec, we import about 10% of our machine from China. We import the cord, and we import a few small parts. Everything else is either made inside our shops or is procured from somewhere here in Utah, or we basically went in concentric circles. If we could buy it in Utah, we want to buy it in Utah if we couldn't make it. If we can't buy it in Utah, then we'll go to Idaho and the states that surround us in the West, right? So we want the economy here in the West to grow. We made that as a very distinct choice. So yeah, U.S. products are very strong, and we use that as part of our brand, that we're made in the USA. What's very interesting though, have you ever heard of Prop 65 in California? Right. So if 100% of your product isn't bought or made in the U.S., and that means even raw stock, like raw bar or any of the metals that you put into your product, you cannot put made in the USA if that product is sold in California. Right. So California is the only state in the country that is that way. And so we've been thinking, anybody know what HS codes are? Right, so HS codes called the harmonized system. Basically what it does is the WTO, the World Trade Organization, has put together this sort of policy on tracking products, right? If this is a phone or an electrical device, there is a code in the World Trade Organization that actually identifies this as an electrical device. And those codes range from 4 to 8 digits, okay? And so these harmonized codes are what basically tells countries all over the world what product is coming into and out of their country. So they can then assess a duty or a tax or some sort of customs on top of that product. And so California, if not 100% of what you buy is made in the USA, you cannot put made in the USA on that product. You can say designed in the USA, you can't put made. So we now have this trade agreement with Korea, and guess what they're telling us to put on the box? Made in the USA, because they know that it's going to sell better in their markets. It's a great brand. So U.S. products are very, very strong globally, and will continue to be so. Even in Russia and China and all these countries that supposedly don't like us, they love our products.
I was at a conference last spring that was focused on Asian American relations, primarily China, but other Asian countries as well. And it was sort of a friendship society, talking about Asian Americans and their connection back with their home countries, ancestral countries. And they had a number of presenters who were very successful Asian Americans. One of the guys was the chief marketing officer for Nike, et cetera, et cetera. I saw this presentation. It was interesting. It talked about demographics in China. And it was talking about the generation that sort of grew up under Mao Zedong, and that represents 10% of the remaining population, sort of 70 and above, and then the next group and the next group. the point of me telling you this is, they said there's this cohort, what we would refer to in the US as the millennials. They said this cohort of the population, all they care about is making money. They said that's what they care about. They don't think about these other kinds of things. When I do trade missions, I've been on trade missions with Harvey, trade missions with the governor. When I go to other countries, I think without exception, that's the feeling that I get from people in business. They want to make money, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean, I'm not talking about like the filthy lucre of money. What I mean is they want to be successful, and in that realm, making money is the definition of success. And so, I'm answering this question in a little bit different way, but in my world, it's not so much of, was this produced in the U.S. or was it viewed as something good in the U.S. or was it made in China and was that bad or was it? It's just how can we all be successful? Can I make this part of it here in the U.S. and that part of it there in China and this? And can we put it together in Indonesia and can we market it to the people in the Philippines? It's almost like they don't care anymore. I mean, they don't think in terms of borders, except as insofar that it gets in their way of being successful. That's when they think about it. But otherwise, I don't see a lot of people thinking about it in those terms.
So we're doing okay on time. We're going to do one more question, then we're going to open it up to the class. The last question is, which up-and-coming economies look the brightest in the next 10 years? So where should we focus our attention?
Yeah, that question would have been answered so differently 6 months ago.
Yes. We were just talking about that out in the hallway.
So different. I would love to say that Brazil would be one of those countries, but I've been saying that for 15 years now. That Brazil someday will get their act together. When they do, it'll be amazing. But I mean, you've got some countries in Southeast Asia that are growing very well, but then of course you've got this problem in Thailand now. Vietnam looks pretty good, but you've got some radical left-wing guys down there too. It's tough. It changes so quickly that to put together a long-term strategy, and that's, I guess, if you're going to buy, you got to buy long-term, right? The short-term stuff is not going to work. So that's a hard question for me to answer.
So, you guys, of course, remember 2 years ago we were in the middle of a presidential election. You may remember, as I did, President Obama and Governor Romney were in a debate where the question was posed, who is the U.S. greatest geopolitical foe? Any of you remember that? Yeah. And what was Governor Romney's answer? Russia. And anyone remember what President Obama's response was? He had a great one-liner, if you remember. He said, Governor Romney, the 1980s are calling and they want their foreign policy back. And so, to Harvey's point, think what's happened in those 2 short years. Between that debate and where we are now. When I walked in, I noticed the cover of the Daily Universe, Back to School, except you guys know where this is from, right? What it's referencing with the Marty McFly. So when I was in high school, this was the most popular movie, Back to the Future. And if you could build a DeLorean and turn it into a time machine, you would have a great competitive advantage over everyone else. And we would have a very good answer to that question.
All right, great. So let's open it up. Any questions that you might have, burning issues? They can be career related as well. If you're interested in international career, we're going to stop 2 minutes before the hour, and so we got about 8 minutes. Yeah.
I was just going to ask each one of you, based on how you guys chose your career paths. I know we had more public sector, private sector with large corporations, or I know you started your own business, so I don't know if you guys have your own ventures as well, but what was your attractions to each industry or each sector, and why did you pick either large or small, and kind of what you found that was your attraction to that?
I found that one door opened and I walked through it, and another door opened and I walked through it. It wasn't directed like Harvey's, this is what I want to do. I mean, I really took it from here's an opportunity, I'm going to move forward with it, and that worked for me.
I wish that were true, Jennifer, that I had, had a distinct plan. And, but it never works that way. I mean, maybe it did for you, Derek, but most of the people that I know, it's really about an opportunity presents itself. You weigh it against what you're currently doing. You take it to the Lord. If it's right, then you go do it. And I don't think that you can sort of sit in that chair out there and really map out from step to step what you want to do with your future. Because you can't. And that can be frustrating. But that's the only way you can grow as individuals, I think. And that's really what this life is about, isn't it? It's about facing challenges, overcoming, and becoming better. And enjoying it along the way. I think having a career in international business gives me a perspective that maybe not a lot of people have. And I've seen other cultures and other faiths and other groups of people that I would have never interacted with otherwise. And it's challenged my beliefs. It's made me really think about who I am and who I want to be. And it's been a great career choice for me. But it might not be the right thing for you. It might not. It might be. So I don't think there's a really straightforward answer to that.
In my life, I'm a planner. That's just my personality. I'm a type A personality. I love to plan everything. I've never planned, I've never had a 5-year plan. I've never had a 10-year plan as it relates to my personal career. And part of that, in fact, the majority of it, is the fact that I found very early on in my career that if I got overly focused on what was next, that my current job satisfaction was totally plummeted. That was just me. I mean, I just learned that. I experienced that. If I was focused on, boy, this is a stepping stone to what, then suddenly I found that I had less passion and less interest in what I was doing right at the moment. Instead, what I tried to do was do whatever job I had, try to do it the very best I could, and there were 2 great effects of that. Number one, people will recognize you for the good work that you're doing. And number 2, you will have inherently prepared yourself for whatever you'll be doing next. The most important thing I can tell all of you today, and I say that because I remember sitting exactly in a very literal way, because I went here to the Marriott School, in a literal way, sitting where you are today, and I promise you, you will all find jobs. I say that because I remember being close to graduation and thinking, how does anyone ever find a job? Like, I see people finding jobs. How does this happen? It seemed like magic to me, but it does happen.
I guess on that note, for those of us interested in becoming involved in organizations like the World Trade Center Utah, what would you recommend doing from our current standing as students?
So go to our website, WTC Utah, sign up for our newsletter. We're primarily an event-driven organization. Come to our events. That will get you immediately plugged into the network. There are great opportunities to learn more about international business as well as being part of the network. We do 2 fellowships a year. They're primarily for people who have just graduated, and then they do a year-long fellowship with our organization, which gives them both the skills as well as the one-on-one relationship building that they need to go propel that into a great career. So the best thing I can tell you on that front is sign up for our newsletter. You do that through our website, and that'll get you immediately plugged in what's happening on an international business in this state.
I would say look for internships. First of all, look for paid ones, but don't pass up an unpaid internship. In our offices, you would be surprised sometimes how few people we get, and they think they have to be political science majors, and they don't. But we want people who are committed, who will work hard, who will follow through. It doesn't matter who you're with. You don't know if you're working with an organization who might be a great lead for you to get a job in the future. It's like, get involved, put out some broad feelers. Don't hesitate to be involved in something that isn't in your field, because it may open up new new opportunities, but then follow through. The people that we have come and intern in our offices, it's like, we know the ones that are committed. We know the ones that are going to get amazing letters of recommendation that they can take with them for years and years because they simply followed through with everything they were asked to do and be positive. When you're with people, I've noticed this in organizations, if you have one person that's a downer, people don't want to be with them. It kind of pulls the whole organization down. Be the person that is upbeat. Be the person that says, yes, we can do it, and I'll help.
So you mentioned that only 5% of companies in Utah export, and I'm curious, why is that? What is keeping companies, not only in Utah but in the U.S. in general, from exporting?
What was your experience when you were go ahead, Harvey?
It's hard. Frankly, it is not an easy thing to do. It's easy to go on a trade mission and find people that you get along with, but it's hard enough driving a domestic business. How many of you guys have tried to start your own businesses? Okay, it is hard. It's a hard thing to do, right? And it's not like you can just pick up the phone and say, hey, I've got this really cool widget or this really cool piece of software that you guys need to buy. It is not that easy, right? So even to be successful domestically, it's a tough thing. And then you complicate that through culture and language and trade agreements and regulation, and it gets even more difficult, right? So I don't think it's that they don't think about it. Some of them, that's the case. They've just thought, oh, I never really thought that my pressed hay would be successful internationally. So sometimes, that's true. Like, they make these little cubes, right? So it's true. They just don't think about a global market. But I think most companies say, I have a hard enough time running my business here. To complicate it again, that would mean I would have to hire another person. It's a financial decision. It's just not easy.
I always tell people, the good news is that the international language of business is still English. True. But even in English, doing international business seems like a foreign language. I mean, just the technical terms alone. You mentioned ITAR. There were a couple other acronyms that we threw out today. And it's just, what is that? I mean, I know you're speaking English, but I don't understand the words you're saying.
I mean, think about just in packaging alone, right? If you're taking a product to Mexico, right? There are different regulatory bodies, there are different certifications, even with NAFTA, right? NAFTA was supposed to get rid of a lot of the regulation, which it has. And I love NAFTA, and don't take it the wrong way, but I'm just saying that even with NAFTA, just in packaging, there is translation, there's certification, there are specific packaging regulatory things that you have to take care of, certain materials that you can't make your packaging out of, right? So it's just not that easy, unfortunately. And that's why people like Derek and myself and Jennifer will always have a job.
Shad, if it's okay, before we end here, I want to put a shameless plug in for an event that the World Trade Center is having on February 11th, specifically for students that are interested in starting international business careers. February 11th, the World Trade Center building in City Creek, downtown Salt Lake City. Starts at 4 o'clock. We're going to have an awesome panel made up of a wide variety of business leaders who are going to talk about how they got their start in international business. I found, when I was a student, I found in talking with students that one of the great ways to learn is to hear the stories of other people. And then that'll be for an hour, and then we're going to have a networking event afterwards. So you're all invited. Go to our website and register. I'd love to see you all there. But this panel that we've got together is specifically for students to learn how to jumpstart their international career.
Do we have another shameless, anyone want to make another shameless plug before we close?
Buy a Blintech. You guys all have $450 laying around, right?
Okay, thank you very much.